how people use politics to kind of remove themselves from having to have an opinion, or they'll use religion or political parties to do that. And and law was supposed to, the way the Constitution's written, anybody could read it and understand it, and that's the way law was supposed to be written. So
a parent can, and they can always do this, but now even more so, they can terraform the entire environment with screens and whatever shows they want to watch, whatever ideologies they want to pump into your brain. Like, they can completely hypocrisize you before you even leave the household to become an adult, right?
Should we be paying for news? Probably. But the issue is, how do we compete with multi-billion-dollar, marketing incomes that some of these news organizations like CNN or Fox, you can look up their annual income. I'm sure it's in the hundreds of millions,
Hey, this is Michael Loebs, my friend from high school. He's a good man, good citizen, concerned citizen, wants to come on and, just talk about some, pragmatic, practical things we can do as a community, as an individual, to empower you in terms of your ability to think and act in the world, right? That's what we really are about on this show, in this podcast, is making sure that people, come away with some sort of nugget. It's all about the nuggets, at least it was for me, and still is to this day in terms of what I listen to podcasts. So I try to recreate that value here, and that's why we brought on Mike, because he had some decent ideas, things that are prevalent and needed to be talked about. Mike is, I don't really know his credentials, so I'll let him do that, man. I'm a terrible podcast host. The most important part, giving your person a shout out, I failed at. Homeology is a good joke, though, so we'll stick with that one. Professor of homeology.
I've just done a lot of reading as far as psychology, sociology, and I enjoy political science, like reading, especially now with how politicized everything is. It's funny that people think they understand politics without understanding historical context of politics. And the ones, it's so much about just knowing where to find information, which is what I wanted to talk to you about. But because it doesn't matter how much research you do if you do it all on one website or listening to one person.
Or even 5 websites.
Or even 5 websites if they're all owned by the same corporation. I wanted to talk about a couple psychologists. One of them was Erich Fromm, and he was an author from the 1940s, and he has several other books that I like. Art of Loving is a really good book on relationships he did. Just goes into detail about how people see love as transactional, and it's especially nowadays. You see people who looking for a short-term relationship or a one-off thing, which 50 years ago wasn't something people could really talk about. But he talks about politics in that way too. How people use politics to kind of remove themselves from having to have an opinion, or they'll use religion or political parties to do that too.
That's interesting. I never even thought about that as the supplementation of your ideology. I mean, I've thought about that, but in that specific context where people use it as a justification to not look at the other potential candidate for whatever position because they're that's interesting.
Right. So yeah, that's a good way to put it. So yeah, people who vote the party line, you don't have to look and say, hey, do I agree with this guy, or is this person similar to me in morals? And they might not even be, in some counties, very very strict Republicans resemble Democrats in other counties, you
Mm-hmm.
know, but people don't care to look into policy, and they don't, so they vote the party line and people get in, you
Yeah.
know.
A lot of people don't have time. I mean, it's. I've looked at. I had my Sherrod Brown. I talked to. I don't know if I. Obviously, probably wasn't emailing him, but I had some communication back and forth because a bill came across this particular. I don't what their affiliation is. I think they're Democratic, but either way, it's good information they send me in terms of like local and state legislation. So I looked at this one law and I was like, okay, let me actually look at one of these. And man, it's thick, right? I mean, it takes
Right.
probably an hour or two to read it, and then you have to go through it and look at it again and really understand it because the terminology is all legal and legislative esque, which is I'm not going to say it's like an active entry barrier to entry because part of me thinks that's kind of necessary, right? You need that legal language to really specify people's rights and stuff. But that was definitely, to your point, an
Well,
interesting interaction of like, wow, if I wanted to get involved, like I really needed to. This is why someone's job is to do this, and they have several aides, et cetera, et cetera. But also in that
well, I
process, I saw like the disconnect between the normal republic, the people, and the actual offices and what's going on. And there's like, I feel like it's a disconnect of interest when we don't have like if we don't have the time to do that as a citizen. What I'm trying to say is if you can't make me understand what that law means and what it's going to do in like 20 minutes as a citizen thoroughly, then we need to work on our system as either in a way of educating people to learn that information better or have resources to find it or reverse have more politicians or less politicians or whatever that would fix that, right? I think you see what I'm
right.
saying.
I think that's like a multifaceted thing because
Mm-hmm.
the fact that our democracy, the Constitution was written with the idea that regular people would be politicians, not
Mm-hmm.
lifelong politicians.
Yep.
People, it was not supposed to be a career.
Mm-hmm.
And, and law was supposed to, the way the Constitution's written, anybody could read it and understand it, you know, and that's the way law was supposed to be written. So the fact that it's like, arcane and bizarre, where, like you said, it takes a lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
a couple weeks to read through a bill. Meanwhile, the bill is being passed in the Senate and nobody's read it. It's got riders, which are like, you have extra add-ons that people are
Mm-hmm.
writing in
Plenty of
to
gerrymandering.
yeah, to whatever it may help, helps a corporation or helps
Mm-hmm.
fulfill some campaign promise. And uh yeah, it's really a terrible thing for a democracy to have
Mm-hmm.
that kind of law. And yeah,
Yep.
we need to move away from that if we can.
Mm-hmm. I've always been a proponent of like one of my deepest like inquiries into the local government is like, why does my mayor not go and talk to? Like, there should be a town hall where the governor sits down with, I know we have representatives and stuff. It just seems like there's such a disconnect between like local legislation, state legislation, and even federal at that point. Like,
Right.
it's almost like as the United States, we almost need to like. I mean, the states make their own laws and stuff, but I almost think there needs to be even more further, like not separation as states. Like, I'm not saying like break up the United States, but like more economic. Maybe you know what I'm trying to say, but we need to treat ourselves economically more like countries. I think that would help separate
Right.
the resources in a way where, like, if Montana was treated more like a country and not just all the middle of America, Montana would be like, hey, we need more. They would be able to maybe vie for more resources for like tech industries and stuff, right? I don't know if that's true or not, but
Right.
you can see
Well,
where
no,
that might.
several states are in the red. They don't produce more than they consume. We were just talking about off the air about Nevada, which, if you look at it
Mm-hmm.
economically, it may produce more than it consumes economically, but as far as food, electricity,
Right. Complete
water,
detractor.
um, it's the exact opposite. And you can see that even with Florida. Florida would hardly exist without a tourism,
Mm-hmm.
industry. And several other places are similar. Texas is a little borderline because it's so big. And it has they have cattle and
A lot of
you know,
liquid resources you can't really measure out. I mean, you can measure cattle, but
yeah, and
it's hard to like gauge
the
it.
Midwest is the best for that. We have, like you said, like water, and like we can grow things. What's that? The call that like the belt of where we can actually grow things. So
Yep.
it helps our economy. But I think
That would
even
give.
in the Constitution they talk about any law that wasn't written in federally should be controlled by states. But we've totally moved away from that. I mean, we're very almost totalitarian with how much power we've given the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Just like with the mask thing. I mean, that's a completely different subject, and I think the state should be able to decide that, and maybe federally as well. But that's kind of pointing to what I was getting to is like if I was the governor of Montana and my people, like a lot of our production was agriculture and we're subsidized. It's hard to say that it would be hard to break it up because you're subsidized. They're federally subsidized in a way, farmers. But at the same time, like that would give the
Right.
farmer the ability to say, okay, well, if you want to buy this pure Montana gold corn, then you would get a tax tariff, like you know what I mean. There'd be more interplay in terms of economic ability of the country. So like if you're a small business owner and you want to make like were discussing earlier, if you want to make like a not polyamorous, but whatever the hell, polycrop farm. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Some more naturalistic
permaculture.
permaculture, yes. And I know in one of the videos I watched, actually, there's a guy who does this out in California, and he makes a profit, and it's not detracting. He's actually sequestering carbon at the same time. I don't know if I said that word, but
Wow.
sequestering, yeah. But yeah, he's like, I don't understand why more people don't want to do this, and it's because they don't make money, or maybe they
No.
do make money, but they're so the guy makes money, but they're so heavily subsidized. Like they're like, why? What's my motivation to do this and put all this effort in and get all these regulations,
Well, you have to
certifications?
wonder. That's a huge issue. Is that subsidizing is moving the market. You are moving the market,
Yep.
and the government was doing subsidizing in the beginning to help with meat prices or food prices or whatever. But at some point you have to realize that subsidizing a product is going to hurt anyone else who's competing. And we have that issue in the tech industry right now where like Google and others, they get government projects, contracts that
Mm-hmm.
pay them. And when you do that, when you have that direct line, which, it's also a big part of the manufacturing consent thing with Noam Chomsky, I was going to talk about. But when you have a direct line with the government or something, you don't want to mess that up. So you
Mm-hmm.
also create a self censorship. You do things you wouldn't do normally. So you not only do you have loyalty, and you have people basically falling in line without actually telling them to do anything.
Yeah.
They do it themselves. You know.
Mm-hmm. Through fear mongering and all those other type of tactics where you can habitually pattern
But you,
somebody to
yeah, you just
buy all
show
the
you
shit
make
off
an
the shelves,
example.
right? Buy all the toilet paper. Toilet paper's gonna run out when it literally never ran out, and the only reason it got low is because people bought 50 cases.
Right.
It's an interesting
Yeah, and
example.
then
People just
yeah, you make.
to touch on. I don't want to skip this by before we move on to Noam Chomsky because it's kind of leaning that way. It's definitely
Yeah,
interesting
go ahead.
where you talked about. I labeled it escaping from freedom, where for instance, I don't know if that was like the show name or something, but when you discuss like how people will be interviewed on the street and you can be like, "What do you think you should do about abortion or something?"
Right.
And they have this huge long opinion in it, and they're just like, for me personally, I'd be like, well, I'd have to reference them. Like before I even answered that question for somebody, like morally, I could answer it, right? Like what the baby feels pain at all, or you know what I mean. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but essentially,
Right.
what I'm saying is like, if you're not actually like a credentialed scientist, biologist, doctor, someone who understands the evolution of a embryo into a baby, like you don't really, you know what I mean? It's hard for you, unless you're just saying, well, God gave me the scripture that says this, or the law says this, right? You don't really. Where do you dip? Should we, as what is that? What is it that makes a person go, oh well, I have to like throw something together real quick and make it this bullshit answer that doesn't really make sense to me even, but I'm saying it to save face, right? Does that make sense?
Right. I guess for me the I guess to use a not so controversial topic, um uh there's the Occupy protests. You remember that?
Yeah.
What was that back in like 2009, something like that, 8, 9, right after the financial crisis. You had people protesting. They were like, "We're the 99%, screw the 1%," and they would go around and ask people, like, "What do you think about this?" And most of them had no real opinion other than like, "Oh, well, they're bad and they should pay taxes," and it was
Exactly.
funny, like they were so vitriolic, they're out there screaming, throwing things, they were sleeping in a tent every night and, had signs and stuff. And then you ask them their opinion and they go, well, this guy told me on the internet that, these people are bad and like really, like
We got to
you don't
get
have
back
any
at these
personal
guys.
opinion. Right. But you can find there was a guy who went around, he called himself like the 1% asking
Mhm.
the 99%. He
I almost
dressed up
watched
like
some
the
of that.
Monopoly man.
Yeah, yeah, I almost
Yeah,
watched some of
it,
that, but I
it's
didn't. I
pretty
never got around
funny.
to it.
It's pretty
I'm
funny
gonna have to
because he
check that out
finds some
now.
really iffy, opinions. People just didn't understand the issue, and maybe they stood on the other side of the issue, but they didn't know it until they had a conversation with, the right
Mhm.
kind of person. And
Who had the ability to not flamboyant, like not inflammatorily, like teach someone about a subject. It's so interesting now. I find that when
right,
to that point in most of the conversations I have is like you're, especially when I was at my job and like teaching someone how to do like whatever part of the job they were failing at. Not you'd be mentoring or teaching them, and it's just like you have to like make them think they know it already, but also teach them it at the same time. You know what I mean? Or otherwise they're like shut down. They're like, I can't be like people just. I think we've lost our coachability through like
no,
the
that's very
internet
true.
self entitlement and like yeah, everyone gets a trophy. Like I even find it
There's
myself
a
sometimes you continuously fighting to like keep that like sense of individual responsibility and like deal with all my own issues
there's
myself, etc.
There is a documentary that would be good for you to, if you can find the clip. The Fuyao plant in Dayton, they
Mhm.
moved in, and they're Chinese run. And when they were talking to the Chinese workers about how to train the Americans, they used this metaphor of a donkey. They said, if you want a donkey to work with you, you pet them the way their hair goes. You don't pet them against the grain of their hair. You pet them the way their hair already lays. And they said that's similar to an American. With Americans, you have to stroke our egos enough.
Yep.
It's got
So
to
then
be
where we can. Mhm.
two compliments and one criticism. It's the only way we work.
Yeah, I find that even with people that are like I'll meet with people that are like part of like supposed to be coaches themselves, and I'll be like have a criticism, and you can just see like the contortion. They're like, oh, like that's not, you know what I mean? And I want to be like, whoa, like wait a minute, like this is just a professional critique. Like, no matter how soft you are with it, it seems like we've lost our ability to be like wrong. Like as a, I don't really know like the linguistic way to like make it sound nice, but essentially we've just lost our ability to say, yeah, I was wrong. Can you coach me on that? And I think a lot of that comes
Right.
from
No.
school, maybe like when we're in school and it's so like unsettling to ask for help. You know what I mean? It makes you feel like uncool or just outright stupid, or people actually call you that after class and stuff like that. So I think that's definitely a part of it. But leaning
It's a little
on,
bit cultural,
yeah,
definitely.
I think a lot of it is cultural. I would even argue that probably the majority of it's cultural. Actually, I had this conversation with mom, and then we'll move on to Noam Chomsky and manufacturing consent, exercising our ability to speak, which is something I wrote. I wanted to ask you about, but mom was actually
Sure.
talking to me about when she was in school, she did a paper on nature versus nurture, and she did nature originally, and she said she would change it now, but to nurture. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, honestly, in 2022, like the amount of control a parent has over like conditioning the whole household environment to reflect their ideology and what they believe and what they want for the kid, there is no like the nurture is like, so say it's probably like 50% of the nature as well too, right? Because they're gonna have friends in school and social media,
Right.
but for the most part, a parent can, and they can always do this, but now even more so, they can terraform the entire environment with screens and um, whatever shows they want to watch, whatever ideologies they want to pump into your brain. Like they can completely like hypocrisize you before you even leave the household to become an adult, right? So I think
Right.
that was an interesting thing, and I wonder if
No, I
that
think
even leads into like what we're talking about with the person's ability to speak.
right. Well, environment definitely has a huge play. You know, that's is environment nature or is it nurture? You know, is it because
Mm-hmm.
it's whether or not you're controlling. Are you allowing the natural environment? Like, you know, are you letting your kid choose? Do they want to be in football or soccer, or are you choosing for them?
Right.
You know, and that answers questions because they're going to run into different people depending on certain things they do
Mm-hmm.
and who they're around. So I think, yeah, micromanaging, you can definitely control a lot more of those things, but you know, whether or not you try. Yeah, explain what you were asking more about. What were you talking about?
Essentially, like I can't remember who I was talking to this about, but I had a thought with in conversation with someone, and I was talking about. I was in our TED Talk group. We were talking about, or maybe it was in class. I can't remember. I think it was class. But essentially, we were talking about how a parent will like say, you're my kid, and you ask me, hey, like, are you pee on the seat or something? And instead of telling you, hey, you don't pee on the seed because eventually that will dry and then bacteria will start to grow in it as a, and in whatever way you could tell that to a kid, right? Instead, I think most parents, and in my experience, my parents even a lot of times will take the lazy route and just be like, don't pee on the seed, don't do that. Here's why, because I said so, right?
Right, right,
We were talking about how that that action itself is a complete like creativity just stunter, right? Because instead of the kid thinking like going through the whole process of thinking about that interesting thing his dad just told him about while learning to not pee on the seat, you're still expressing that like urge as a kid to like, when they're like, don't use the power tools, and you're like, oh my god, if I could just use the freaking power tools, like you would just, you know what I mean? You would just salivate over the idea of even turning on the drill. And like
right,
I think
right.
in letting a child explore that, you take away these like hyper neurotic tendencies to want to like scratch that itch, right? And so we were talking about like an ability to exercise your ability to speak as a person. I think a huge part of that is our like not I don't want to I'm not gonna call it cancel culture, but it almost reflects that, right? As a kid, when your parents like say you want to go be a monk and your parents want you to be a doctor, like they have the ability to literally censor your entire ability to express that, right? And then you could twist that into
Right.
some malformed habitual pattern or like moral value structure or ethic or something, and that just wastes 10 years of your life. You see what I'm saying? And then you don't have the ability to speak, and then you have that hyper like critical aspect of you where you can't have an open mind, and then what I'm saying is it makes you uncoachable, right? Because you don't feel like you have the freedom to think through something like peeing on the seat or spilling the milk. Like if you spill the milk 10 times in a row, obviously it's going to get to a yell, right? I'm not saying don't over, underparent your kids, but I was just I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Like I was wondering if
No,
that makes sense.
that makes sense. No, I think you have to. I think that goes for adults too. Is everyone should be allowed to speak. I think you know they've shown that the children that cause the least amount of harm, as far as like causing shootings and stuff, most of the kids that do those kinds of things were not allowed access to guns, or kids that end up shooting their friend on accident, or like you said, using a power tool and hurting themselves. It's the best way you can do is to introduce them to it, show them how it's dangerous, and then just make it a normal thing. You know, try not to make them afraid of it. Try to not
Mm-hmm.
fetishize it in their mind that, oh well, when I get to a certain age I'll be able to do this. That's
Right.
a huge thing. Is alcoholism isn't as bad in Europe because children are allowed to drink, at a younger age. They'll
Mhm.
only be allowed like a glass of wine or a beer. But when you're 14, that's huge.
Yeah.
You get to sit with the adults and drink their alcohol. But speech, yeah, I think you have to be able to say what you're thinking. I think filtering yourself will just lead to you coming up with uh, subconsciously or consciously, you'll do things to spite that person, or
Mhm.
um,
Some sort of
it'll come
supplementary
out in other
behavior.
ways. Yeah, and especially with children, you can see that.
Mhm.
See that with a parent who keeps shushing a child. Eventually, they'll throw a tantrum or throw something, and
Mhm.
and then they get the attention they wanted.
Right. That's we
But
were talking about that with my nephew the other day.
right. Um, Yeah, I wanted to if it's not too early, I wanted to move on to the Noam Chomsky thing. You said you haven't read Manufacturing Consent, but you've heard of it.
Mm-mm. No, I definitely heard of it. I listened to a little bit of him, but I'm not gonna posture study him because I definitely don't know like his ideologies through and through. But I know that he's like a linguist and he talks about
Right.
how language kind of you know what I mean. That's about my extent to his knowledge right there.
He his book Manufacturing Consent, it's the full title is The Political Economy of the Mass Media, right? Where he talks about just how, like we were saying earlier, how uh, news stations will uh, report in a nice way about certain things or avoid reporting on
Mm-hmm.
other things to keep their um, their links
Constituencies
to
happy.
yeah, well, no, more so their when you have well, I have somebody in the State Department I talk to. You have these certain people that you can talk to that you have links to them, and or you can bring people on, whatever you call that. They'll do that to keep the people that they bring on happy, to keep their links with
Mm-hmm.
with the government or wherever. Because without their exclusives, a news organization loses the ability to report on time or accurately, or have you know breaking news. Oh, we learned this first, and that's really what makes a newspaper, or I guess nowadays an online news organization, money, is the ad revenue from all the clicks.
Mm-hmm.
But um, I guess I guess I was gonna bring that up because we were talking about how can lose the reality in that, the truth, because then they'll avoid reporting on certain things because
Mm-hmm.
they're afraid, whether or not it's true, they'll completely avoid reporting on a topic.
Yeah, I think I find that more. I don't necessarily watch the news as much as I used to, like, practically at all, really anymore. But I definitely should. I'm not saying you shouldn't watch the news, but I can feel that each news station has a persona. We'll say a little bit of a persona
Right.
that they try to. And I mean, I think what I was gonna lean into, the thought I had when you mentioned that is, it kind of comes to us as the consumers of information to care enough about news to maybe pay a subscription to a news place or something. I don't do that personally, but I was just thinking from like
Oh,
spitballing ideas, like what's a good ideology we should take as a public, right? Because I think that we've definitely undervalued the effectiveness at protecting not civilians, but just the basic citizen that news stations actually give us. Like the the incentives to catching the shitty company for doing the shitty practice now in your local area is so minuscule to a news company that they don't send the guy to report on it anymore. Do you get what I'm saying from that perspective? So like when the New York Times
no,
gets
yeah.
it's a huge scoop to say like go look at this crime boss or something that no one cares about. You know what I mean? It detracts from their ability to look at those little things that could turn into the big news stories because they're too busy just manufacturing these clickbait stories and hiring these new woke journalists or whatever the terminology you want to use, right?
No, I would. Yeah, that's like it's the BuzzFeed era of
Yeah.
news, and
But that's our,
you could
but you
almost
see what I'm
blame
saying?
that
That's
on
almost on
them.
our fault though, because they would sell
Right.
us good information if we only paid for good. Like if the demand was each news article is highly vetted and each news station reports on it, and while they have different takes and maybe different perspectives, and they went at different times to this country and spoke to this leader, they're all focused on providing us the most available news information. You know what I'm saying? That way you can still have a
Yeah, we
Democratic and a Republican station. You just, and that's what we need, right? We need both in different and diversity. I think diversity is one of the, if you want to call it, universal laws of whatever, physics, life, reality. I think diversity is one of those things that the universe favors, right? So from that
right.
perspective, I think we've lost that. We lose the
Well,
diversity of attention.
we do pay for those things though, but we pay for them with what they're teaching us. Somebody else is paying. If it's free, somebody else is paying
Yeah.
for it. That's just
No.
the
Yeah.
reality. They say there's no such thing as a free lunch, and I guess people say, "Oh, well, you pay with your time or whatever." No, you're paying with somebody else is paying. In reality, they're paying for you to see it. So with the clickbait culture, you have to
Mm-hmm.
wonder who paid for you to see that. Should we be paying for news? Probably. Um, but the issue is how do we compete with multi-billion-dollar, you know, marketing incomes that some of these news organizations
Mm-hmm.
like CNN or Fox, you can look up their annual income. I'm sure it's in the hundreds of millions, and how do you compete with that?
Yeah.
Maybe you only make $50,000, $100,000 in a year as a small time like news organization. You're not going to get the scoops. You're not going to get the exclusives.
No one's
Leave those
calling you.
out. And yeah,
Nobody's
nobody's gonna
calling you
call
for
you and
that ten
tell you what's
thousand
going on.
dollar lead that could potentially be trash, but you you
Yeah.
have the profit to actually look through it. Mm.
Well, yeah, you might have the time, to look at smaller stories, but are people really gonna care as much?
Mm-hmm. I agree. That's where I kind of was. From your perspective, do you think like the whole manufacturing consent from Noam Chomsky's? Because I kind of get the base ideology of it, right? It's a pretty common concept people
Right.
are starting to talk about more. Is like, is advertisement really that healthy of a thing to pump down a child's throat 24/7, etc., etc. But from that perspective, as a citizen and as not like what's a pragmatic tool or guideline that I could use as a citizen to decide how much you know what I mean? Like, what's the individual's responsibility when it comes to ensuring that they give enough of their attention to the correct entities or information providing companies? You know what I mean? Where if I have an hour of attention a day, I want to spend on learning truthful, factual evidence, right? You would say New York Times, go there, right? Is that still the place to go? Should we just pay for the newsletter, and should we just should we subsidize news organizations as a country to say, okay, you don't, okay, here's what we want. The people have decided the news organizations are now going to be subsidized to the tune of $300 million max per year, right? And so now you guys have to fight for that money, but or you know what I mean? Maybe not make them fight for it because that would provoke other interests. But you see what I'm saying? Create some sort of competition where the people decide, here's what we want this money to go into, fair and equal news, information. You know what I mean? No one's allowed to give this company money outside of the subsidy that from, you know what I mean? It wouldn't be a governmental organization, but it would be a privately ran civilian organization, maybe? Something like that terminology, where we decide our money, we don't want to pay fucking ad subscriptions, you know what I mean? We don't want to pay for any of that junk. And we want you to report on
Right.
these issues, like, you know what I mean?
Well, I think in reality, I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but when you look at news organizations and you see that they have a lot of former FBI, CIA, Defense Department, you you see that you can look into something. It's called Project Mockingbird. There was an open U.S. government conspiracy to, change opinions about war, or I guess that was during the Vietnam War, which is what Chomsky wrote his book about. Was mainly about how the media was, you know, sort of manipulated so people were pro war, pro Vietnam War,
Yeah.
which didn't really work in the end. In the end, people realized it was terrible. because people coming back with stories but you I guess the first thing you would have to do is not to inject. You're saying inject money into small sources. I would say the opposite. Remove big money and remove all this uh, terrible, like just all this ad revenue that
Hmm.
these other news organizations are getting, or government money they're getting, because they're being subsidized as we speak. You know, there's a reason that they report the way they do about certain things. You really, I would say it's
I
more of
didn't
an
know that.
institutional issue. You know, I would say that the ones that get attacked, the smaller non-institutional news organizations, those ones, you know, they're attacked so you know so vehemently by the state that they tell you they're fake news or whatever. Like you can find Wikipedia articles. Well, these are fake news organizations. Don't listen to them. Like a big one right now is Project Veritas, and I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Yeah,
Have
I've
you?
heard of it, but I don't know like the details of it.
Well, the fact that they're doing undercover you know that's another thing. It's a trigger word to say these things because people have already shut them down in their head. Well, that's fake. That's what they read. But they did like undercover videos where they have people talking about things, whether they work for the government or whoever, and they'll say things that are counter with the public narrative is, you know, and you can't really say anything about a primary source. I mean, that's coming straight from the horse's mouth, as they say.
Yeah.
But so why can't they succeed? Well, they've been banned on Twitter. They get banned on
Hmm.
social media. Their website gets shut down. They get arrested. They got raided by a SWAT team. They had their hard drives stolen by the government. And you go like, well, I is that really what we want with freedom of speech in America? I mean, it's starting to feel a little more fascist with that kind of thing happening.
Yeah. I definitely. That's my worry is that, like you say, because it's hard to. Yeah. I mean, I don't have an answer, but you can sit here and you know posture different ways of solving the solution, which is what this podcast is about, right? But it's definitely a highly complex and difficult one to solve, which is why I make that caveat. But I definitely do think it's heavily influenced by an individual's ability to make their own decisions and think about the right choices and just look up information correctly, which all of those tools and resources are just so abundant now. Like Google's right there,
Right.
Google Scholar's right there. If you don't like Google, you have Bing. If you don't like Bing, you got I'm sure there's other sources. I don't necessarily know any of them, but I'm sure Mozilla has their own search. You know what I mean? There's hundreds of different ways to like create good involvement, good active involvement as a citizen, to where you're not wasting a whole bunch of time that you don't want to be wasting on politics, which is presumably why we have politicians. But to your point, there's just such an issue every time that I have a conversation with politics or with the news that it's almost like we should start doing something, right? Which is kind of why we're having this conversation. So what would you do if someone gave you $300 million? And would you? And I'm talking when I say that I mean like build a whole new organization from the scratch. That's and we'd have to like design different layers of protection from institutional takeover or governmental takeover or privatized takeover. Things that would
Right.
you know keep it a to use a cliche a news room for the people by the people of the people blah 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 right how do we do that then like if I'm an investor and I want good news for my kids etc and you see this big problem going down.
I would look to my biggest issue right now is I see like you'll see some truth reported by Democratic media and some truth reported by
Mm-hmm.
Republican-based media, but what the main thing you need to be reporting on is things that neither of them are reporting on, and I think I would hone in on issues like issues that are not controversial, like the economy, right? The talking about the economy having issues right now is not controversial. It, you know, I think it and personal rights. talking mainly about freedom of speech and personal rights, and talking about economic issues. Because when people cannot afford, like you said, maybe they have an hour a day. Well, that's a huge problem in
Right.
itself. You know, I think the fact that people, 50 years ago had, you know, weekends off. I hardly know anybody who has a whole weekend off. I mean, do you
Yeah.
personally know anybody who gets weekends off on a
Yep.
consistent basis?
I just had that
Right.
conversation
But
with someone else. With that talk through.
but what kind of culture are you trying to create at that point by
Right.
doing that? You're creating a culture of people who don't have time to be informed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if money would be the fix. I really don't. I think that
We gotta fund it somehow. So even if you take the money out, like, what's
what would you
because I
create
agree with
even
you
without
that money
money?
is going to complicate it either way. $300 is a lot of money, and people are going to be, no matter how many virtuous people you put in an organization, there's going to be a couple of those, greedy mice trying to get as much cheese as possible. So
Right.
what's like you know what I mean? What's the constitution for a news industry? Honestly, I think that's what we need. We need like
Right.
to bring in the House and the Congress and sit down and say, which would obviously never happen, right? Because they're all pocketed and paid for by these corporations that we're talking about. But
Right. Lobbyists.
ideologically, we would have the states say about these mayor. You know what I mean? It would go down to a mayoral level where people go and vote at their local civic center to say, do we want this organization, and then have a set of criteria. That's how I feel like almost it's almost un-American that we don't have like some sort of like monthly like we don't have to call it like the Patriots podcast or something where the president gets on and like hoorahs us, but like we should have some sort of like podcast where weekly someone like you or me, just a normal citizen, sits down with like the vice president or the secretary of
Right.
defense, and they say, here's what we're doing, and that person would be the voice of the people, and they would say, I've got these 50 assistants that work with me on this podcast. We've taken 150,000 letters from people from this podcast. Here's the questions the public wants answered. You know what I mean? Would that be a way that gets people involved and enough to get them to watch, right? Because you're getting on people that are like high level, presumably interesting and educated people, right? Like the Secretary of Defense or State, or.
Yeah, I think only a terrible opinion can withstand scrutiny. A good opinion or a good idea should be able to withstand the strongest criticism. You know, so anybody who's in politics shouldn't fear conversation or critical thought or I think we've got to start with children. Teaching children how to think critically, how to not view, I would say, not even view news as a primary source anymore. I think we should move away from that. I think we should start viewing, what you can see, what you can hear. With the evolution of cell phones being everywhere. I don't believe something until I see a video of it, and even then,
That's how I feel.
it seems like I've been tricked. I've been tricked before, even since. Um, but and you can see that with schools, with how they become turned into like memorization halls, where they're just cramming and then cramming for a standardized test when they should be, free and open learning environments where kids learn how to think critically. But it's just this panicked, like running from one location to another as adults and children.
Yep.
And you remember in school, how is a 2-3 minute spring break between classes? How is that reasonable?
Yeah,
What kind of conversation can you have?
See, that's the problem. I think, like, for instance, why are you giving a high schooler a chance to have a study hall? There's like 3 of us that actually use that period to study. That should be, you know what I mean? I think that just, I don't know how like education has changed, but just the way that it's mandated is just absolutely wild. And we have to understand in 2022 that creativity is of vital importance to like a productive employee. Like I just don't see how we could still just follow this model of like we talked about with like the parental model where you just put your kid into shape versus letting your kid grow into what they want to do. Or so I mean, I think we've touched on a couple of these, but it will be good to wrap it up and just say like, so if someone comes up to you, Mike Loeb, and says, hey, how do I get involved actively in positive governmental change over education or economics or getting news, creating some sort of government podcast where you have the availability to get on and hear the Secretary of Defense explain his plan. That seems like a great idea to me. Everyone loves podcasts. What do you think in terms of how can the person become more involved in those ways?
Yeah, I think it all has to start with your local government. I think everyone should, if you can, if you are politically knowledgeable or politically involved, be as involved with your local government as physically possible, because it will have the most direct effect on you. People see that now, with whichever side you're on with the mask mandates, now you want to show up to the city hall hearings. They haven't seen anybody in those halls in years,
Mm-hmm.
Those were empty before
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
But I think we all have to do that, and then I think we all need to, we need to have politicians that are held to bear for their opinions, for their
Mm-hmm.
statements. I think it's really setting a terrible precedent that some of our leaders, including the president, will just come out to speak and then say, "Sorry, no questions," and walk away. I mean, although the people asking the questions though are still the same, the news organizations and stuff. But we need to have them at least asked a few questions. I can't even imagine what a democracy would be without, because they're supposed to answer to us. That is the definition of what a representative democracy is.
Literally.
Is
Representatives
that
constituents.
stand for them.
Damn. No, I definitely agree with you there. I think our politicians have become a poor reflection of the actual, and I think echo chambers has a lot to do with it. I think we've hit a lot of the main pillars of those issues. But I definitely agree. Just be as involved as you can. Like, I went and served at the polls, and it was just really interesting how there wasn't a lot on the vote. There was like 4 or 5 votes, but just like 10 people showed. It was like 220 people of the 44. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I know we got to like 15% of eligible voters actually came and voted. And they were predominantly older generation. And I mean, obviously, this is not talking about New York City, but I mean, that's still a little. This is still a little bit. Those are just the registered voters. How many people are old enough that could vote that aren't registered? And of the registered voters who were, had the ability to show up and vote, registered, only 15% showed up, which was, 500 people out of a, 20,000 person city or whatever. It's just interesting to me that maybe this is what we need, Mike. What we'll do is we'll set people up with a little like muzzle. It'll be like a dystopian like Blackbeard thing, and if you haven't voted and you start to talk about politics, it'll just go. It just cuts you off from having the ability. You don't get an opinion if you don't vote. You don't know how to talk in person about politics. Obviously, that's a joke, but it's almost what we do to each other, right? Because we're like, oh, well, your ideal doesn't fit into my model of how the world should be to make me feel comfortable and correct. So now I'm putting a virtual muzzle on you. And if you're Twitter, you can do it for real, right?
The main issue is nobody's voting because they don't feel like anybody stands for what they stand for.
But
that's a huge issue too.
I completely agree, because once we lose faith in our own, like if it's that big of a problem, then what the hell are we doing not changing it?
It is.
You know what I mean? It's like everyone's just like watching the ship burn. Like there's no one driving America, and we're just like, yeah, but the Kardashians are on. The Voice is on. You haven't seen The Masked Singer? Oh my God, Lollipop's gonna get demasked today. You don't understand. I just can't go out and vote today. You know what I mean? It's like, I think
Biden has like 20% approval rating, and he was he had the most votes in American history.
Right.
So
Interesting.
however you
people
feel
are
about
just
that,
salty as hell at Trump, and like I agree with you. Like I wasn't voting for either of them. I voted Libertarian. I don't even know who the guy was, but damn, he'd probably be better than this shit. But I mean, I don't want to like politicize the podcast, because I definitely have reprehensible things and good things to say about both of those people. But it's just the numbers. You got to look at the numbers, like you're saying. Like everyone just got mad and went out and voted. Like that's what it sounds like. At least I'm not saying that's what you did as a person or what people watching did, but that's kind of what it seems like, right?
Right.
We just didn't like the current president so much, which is fine because it's a free republic. But here's the whole point, and this is a good point to end on. At what point does a free republic become a totalitarian, like veal of a democracy, right? How much
Right.
responsibility does the people give away before the government is the 51% majority stakeholder? And you know what I mean? Like when less than half of the people are coming to vote in your district. Now, I don't know if this trend continues over the next few years, then I really get worried. But you see my point here. Like, if only 15% of the people that actually registered, which is probably roughly maybe half, if that, you see what I'm saying? Like, we're such a low percentage in our democracy is actually participating, and the other, 75, 85% in this case was just out consuming or creating the labor for the structure that allows other people to consume, right? Which is capitalism, how it functions and how the world functions. But at what point do we say, perhaps we start to develop some interesting industries that just promote growth, or they don't promote consumption, they promote, you know what I mean?
Right.
Wouldn't it be weird to have a business that's built on using less of something? Not just for the, profitability aspect of it, but I think that it comes down to us and doing things like this and having conversations where even if 20 people watch this and they only watch 10%, hopefully it'll be enough information to help them make an informed decision, which is the whole point of this, right? So with that, Michael, if you have any points that you want to flesh out, is there anything else we didn't talk about that you wanted to get through? We didn't talk about we did talk about election inconsistency and the government and geo examples. I don't know what I meant by that, but
no, I guess I'm just to help people. I would say honestly, uh, use alternatives to Google or YouTube or whatever you can. There's like BitChute and I know DuckDuckGo. Like the huge inconsistencies in googling things and then looking them up on DuckDuckGo is mind blowing. I mean, you could talk for hours about that, but which tells me that they're being set up that way on purpose. But I guess no, that was pretty much everything I had to say. I just hope people learn a little bit of critical thought and move away from just trying to escape from the freedom. They move away from giving up their freedom to something larger than them.
Yep. Out of the I mean, how much comfort do you want that you'll throw away your entire family's future by not voting? I can, from a personal perspective, it's definitely understandable though, because until I started to really pay attention to political issues and really just people in general and psychology, I didn't know half of the twisted nether of excitement, we'll call it, of that politics is. I was like the normal person who thought Republicans were Republicans and Democrats were Democrats, and whatever ideology you put behind that is your own. But it's just very interesting. The more and more you dig into, I can't remember what album with this was on, but some rapper, is a final thought. He said, damn, I lost it. It was really good. He was basically talking about how one day you wake up and you realize adults actually don't understand what's going on either, fully. You know what I mean? But interestingly enough, we have Michael Loeb here to help soothsay those ripples in your ideologies, right? He's here to massage them in, and hopefully you got some stuff out of this today. And thank you for watching. Mike, do you want to shout out your Twitter or something? This is now your chance. I have 5 followers, but they might come look at you.
No, I'm pretty much dead on social media, but I think this has moved me towards. I definitely thinking about doing something now, so I'll let you know in the future.
Yeah, and like I said, next time you get an idea, come on, brother. That's why I like Discord, because it is a little bit impersonal, and it's like a digital format when I put it up and stuff, but it still gives us the ability to, like, second you have a thought, you can hit me up, I can look at your notes, and then by the end of the week, we've got a podcast out, right? And it's, this one was so far 54 minutes, so I'll edit it